So this is going to be my review for The Blade Itself, dark epic fantasy novel by Joe Abercrombie from 2006, and it was about 530-ish pages long. Already among fantasy fans, it's like a modern classic in its own weird sub-genre of dark fantasy. People call it grim dark, and so I want to talk about this a little bit and things I like about it the most and what you can expect if you're interested. So, of all the fantasy novels I've read at this point in my life, which isn't a terrible amount, but I don't know, maybe under 50, I would say that this series is easiest to get into on a certain level that has to do with like scratching that itch for realistic combat and adrenaline, that where the violence, it doesn't feel particularly enjoyable because it's so well written and so descriptive, like what's going on in the characters' heads when they're engaged in that. You feel the fear present much more than any sort of chivalry or unreal. So basically there's a very contemporary realistic feeling to the violence that feels like it's telling the truth about that, and it feels like it has the tone of a horror story as well. And so it doesn't really have any sort of political agenda. It just presents concerning the action and violence aspects of the book, scenes and aspects. Instead, it's just altogether very well imagined, and to me, that's the most unique, biggest highlight of the book and takeaway, because I like pulp, and I sometimes like pulp with an exploitation tone. If it's all out exploitation, I usually get sick and don't recommend it. Those sort of thing, and more have negative criticism of those types of things. Now, this book would be like that if it didn't also have a sort of tone that was sardonic and a little bit pessimistic for an aspect of humanity that's been proven throughout history, especially in the Dark Ages, for which it is obviously heavily inspired. And so by that I mean it's self-aware that it's fictional and that it's kind of exploitative, if that's the right word. It goes into the territory of trying to modernize like classic swords and sorcery, and I think it succeeds marvelously because it's not a satire and it's not black comedy per se, but there are the ever so slightly an element of self-parody in the plot. For example, a certain wizard is recruiting the main characters on some larger quest of which we're never keyed into, of what his motives are, and we also, it's so boring that it's hard to keep track of and mysterious and unknown to us, because we, the audience, Abercrombie knowing his audience, are already so familiar with so many typical fantasy plots that he knows that he's a good enough writer that we're not going to care, and we don't, as we are going on a million sort of establishing tangents along the way of developing the characters and the world. And it would be boring if it wasn't filled with so much dry humor and so damn well written. And at the same time, the writing, and just in my personal opinion, it really flows with a more classier prose style that we don't see as often anymore by someone who's just a good writer. Good dialogue, especially good descriptions, especially during action scenes. But on top of that, somehow miraculously, that same technical aspects of writing modernizes how you would imagine that certain mercenary soldiers and everyday grunts working for some odd who cares dictatorial king with some bullshit crusade, having them fight over some plot of land and bringing God into it hypocritically for some bullshit cause. And like the sort of dialogue that they would have spoken to each other feels so believable and in spirit to what I imagine based on my own knowledge of European history at this point, especially in the Dark Ages, for which I have a significant amount of ancestry myself. No, just kidding. No, I do, but I don't believe in ancestral memory. That'd be cool though, like in Assassin's Creed. But the point I'm trying to make is like it's exactly like you would imagine that would be adapted to modern speak. So while there's like classier elements, it never feels like overwritten or poetic. It feels so gritty and down to earth and believable, and that just somehow grounds the whole story in this realism that, although there are a few sort of vague, fuzzy aspects of the world building, especially the history, that isn't as fleshed out and detailed as other major popular fantasy novels that I myself and most of other similar fantasy fans have been spoiled on. It makes up for that in terms of overall immersion that we often ironically don't get in those same types of overly detailed novels with world building. And that's because there's something that's just really alive about the books. It has like, it gets my blood pumping, and like a good horror story, there's this pulpy element to the overall vibe of the story that's highly specific. That it's really just like a testosterone fueled guilty, indulgent pleasure, and that's what I think Abercrombie's greatest strength is. And the second greatest strength would be just the sheer writing ability. So doesn't have a lot of redeeming, enlightening, or intellectual moral arguments to make. The second book has more heart and humanity than the first book in that regard, but I think it makes up for that by, like I said before, it's somewhat self-aware in that it is pure entertainment, and it has the heart of a sort of movie in a way, like a really good movie. Like, if you could imagine, I love one of these descriptions that I'm going to steal that was on the book. It says like Quentin Tarantino or as directed by Akira Kurosawa in a medieval setting or something like that, and it's totally true. Like, this would be imagine a movie about the Dark Ages that Akira Kurosawa wrote, directed by Quentin Tarantino, written by an English scholar of history. You know, like that would be there. That's like, for me personally, my personality, the things that I'm able to get into, which not everyone is gonna be able to get into. That's like my favorite. There's nothing I like greater than that, really. It's something. There's something kind of timeless about it too. It almost feels like a spiritual successor or a modern adaptation of like Robert E. Howard or something, Conan the Barbarian, you know, which by comparison now feels like a comic book because it's just that well modern paced and well written. And so, a few criticisms about the Blade itself, the first book in the First Law trilogy. For a lot of people who don't appreciate the sort of slow burn and then suspense rising and then random build up an explosion of action scenes, and the visceral overall cinematic feel of it, that's not going to be good enough to get through all of the denser aspects of establishing the world, the characters, their histories, the personality, dialogue exchanges, present political affairs in the main kingdom and everything. And so that does tend to get a little bit dry and aimless feeling at times, and there's not a sort of sense of larger mystery guiding all these characters, despite the fact that the characters are all mysterious and interesting, and some of them indirectly damn hilarious. And so that is going to be a turnoff to certain like average readers with low attention spans who don't appreciate novels or have patience. But most people who read this book are going to love it like I did. Another thing that makes it well known is the black comedy, the dark humor, the sardonic tone, which is really a guilty pleasure that you sort of have to remove yourself from to enjoy it. Like, a lot of people make the association that all popular fantasy out there is going to be like Tolkien or something, and it's going to, or any fantasy that comes from England is going to have some sort of Arthurian nobility themes in the background or something. Not in this case. In this case, it feels like it has the spirit of a horror movie, and so that's what you should really expect. The weird irony of that is that it's just so classy in terms of style, but the substance is very dark and not like, it's not a modern classic or anything, if you know what I mean. It is very almost want to say irresponsible. I don't even know how to explain. The second book I like even better, and but the first book, the second book sort of it feels like the first two books should have been one book. And another small complaint that I've noticed other critics have of the first book as well as myself is that for all of the work of time spent, establishing the world and the characters, it ultimately doesn't end in a place that feels like there is any story or quest accomplished or anything really done. It really just feels like a large, elaborate setup for something more important to happen, and so it feels like the first two books are one book in spirit. I personally think that the overall quality, which is really rare in the fantasy genre, just the amount of detail and fun and various things, unique qualities that are fun to be had in this book, make up for it a great deal. But pretentious, nitpicky type critics and super opinionated nerds, like even more than me, are going to complain about that, and already have. So it's because it's been out for already 18 years, which is weird to think about. So yeah, 2006 I think. And so Blade itself by Joe Abercrombie. It's a great bloody time. I highly recommend. I've read it twice. I read the second book and soon to read. I read Before They Are Hanged, and then I have The Last Argument of Kings here, the third book in the series. And so yes, definitely read it if you want a more gritty, realistic, immersive, original dark fantasy world in a civil apocalyptic breakdown with very flawed anti-hero, brutal, badass main characters, and good humor that gives no shits, that's a fantasy for adults in every way, and is somewhat of just a really good escape. So highly recommend. See ya.